After VE Day, whole armored formations lay where they broke down or were abandoned. Panthers half buried on road shoulders, tigers dark and holed out in orchards, Panzer IVs stripped until only a shell remained. The sight was everywhere across Germany and occupied Europe. Metal carcasses, missing turrets, crew-made holes, and components peeled off for spares. So where did those machines go? Did they vanish into secret bunkers, or did a more mundane fate await them? The short answer is this. Most of those surviving German tanks were systematically demilitarized and recycled for peacetime industry. A significant minority were set aside for study and testing by the Allies. A smaller but notable portion was redistributed to other armies and saw further use, and only a handful survived as preserved exhibits in museums or monuments. Throughout the immediate post-war years, victory produced practical choices: study, reuse, or scrap, and the material reality of millions of tons of steel and thousands of hulks shaped the decisions. If you like deep dives into war history, subscribe and stick around for the full story. In the spring and summer of 1945, the armored landscape of Germany was chaotic. Units surrendered in place, crews abandoned vehicles, and many tanks were deliberately disabled to prevent capture. In the Ruhr, Bavaria, and around Berlin, whole roads and farm tracks were littered with immobile vehicles. Some were simply out of fuel or suffered battlefield damage. Others had been killed by their own crews, main guns spiked, engines sabotaged, radiators punctured, and tracks removed. Repair parts had already been scavenged by retreating units or by locals. Allied occupation forces, arriving in May and June, confronted an inventory problem of immense scale. Thousands of operational and non-operational armored vehicles sitting in fields, factories, and depots. Allied responses reflected different priorities and capacities. Technical intelligence teams moved quickly to catalog, secure, and evaluate important examples. U.S. technical intelligence outfits worked in collection points such as Oberhörsel and Geldorf, identifying which tanks would be useful for study or demonstration. Selected vehicles were shipped across the Atlantic to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where engineers and ordnance officers put German designs through instrumented examinations and gunnery trials. Britain's Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REMI, worked at sites including Hillersleben and Sennelager, and carried out local trials at proving grounds like Lulworth and Grafenwöhr. The Soviets, operating trophy brigades and specialized testing units, concentrated many captured vehicles at Kubinka and other ranges on their side of the Iron Curtain, integrating some into training units or park collections. The testing these teams conducted was methodical and revealing. Engineers at Aberdeen and the British ranges sought to understand what made German tanks distinctive. They found several recurring patterns. German tanks often carried superior optics and firepower. Guns had high muzzle velocity, and sights were refined, giving crews excellent long-range engagement capabilities compared to many Allied tanks. The sloped armor design on certain models, especially the Panther, proved conceptually effective in deflecting shots. At the same time, tests and field reports repeatedly showed that driveline components were a chronic weak point. The final drive, the gearbox segment that transmits engine power to the road wheels and tracks, was especially prone to failure under field conditions. Allied engineers recorded frequent breakdowns attributed to the final drives and associated gearboxes. The designs, while technically advanced in some respects, were also maintenance-intensive. Simpler, more robust systems, like those on the ubiquitous Sherman or the Soviet T-34, tended to be easier to keep running in austere conditions. Those findings had practical consequences. Intelligence and test reports praised the Germans' optics and guns, but they equally emphasized the fragility of complex mechanical systems and the logistics burden that accompanied them. In plain terms, a tank that could outshoot an opponent on paper still needed crews, fuel, spare parts, and a working final drive to stay effective in the field. For the victors, studying these strengths and weaknesses informed both immediate disposal decisions and longer-term thinking about post-war armored design. Disposal, however, was not a purely technical exercise. Policy drove large-scale demilitarization. The Allied Control Council issued directives between 1946 and 1948, ordering systematic disarmament and the destruction of German weapons systems that might again be used for aggressive purposes. That meant tanks at depots, in scrapyards, and lined up near railheads were scheduled to be rendered inoperable and, in many cases, to be cut up. Steelworks across the ruined industrial heartland became focal points for that work. Records indicate plants in Bochum, Essen, and Magdeburg were among the places where tank hulks were broken down, their metal melted into billets, and the recovered steel recycled into reconstruction projects, bridge girders, factory frames, rail lines, and housing materials for a devastated continent. The practicalities of scrapping were vivid and sometimes jarring. Rail cars carried rows of hulls to yards where acetylene torches opened armored plates and turrets were detached for separate processing. In other places, the tanks were simply used for heavy civil engineering tasks. Along the Enns River, for example, evidence suggests that obsolete hulls were placed to stabilize embankments. In quarries and riverbeds, hulks were used as fill and revetment material. At training ranges, obsolete vehicles became target hulks. Lulworth and Grafenwöhr saw tanks sighted as live fire targets, stripped further through practice, and finally left as crumpled shells. These were not heroic endings. They were practical answers to the question of what to do with thousands of tons of armored steel when rebuilding Europe demanded raw materials and open ranges for Allied armies. Not all captured armor went straight to the torch. Commanders and ministries recognized value in reusing or redistributing serviceable tanks. France, for instance, pressed a number of Wehrmacht vehicles into service after the war. The French 503rd Combat Tank Regiment took Panthers into its inventory for evaluation and limited operational use, but the combination of spare parts shortages and the complexity of the machines meant that these Panthers were largely retired by the early 1950s. Czechoslovakia illustrates a different strand of post-war practice. Czech factories took what they could from German experience and, in the immediate post-war years, shifted to produce vehicles like the Hetzer tank destroyer, the Jagdpanzer 38. Concepts were refined and eventually became the Czechoslovak-produced G13 for export. These factories exported vehicles to neutral customers such as Switzerland and continued to use modified wartime components where feasible. Spain kept a number of Panzer IVs in service much longer than Western European states, and some of those vehicles later left Spanish inventory. Records indicate a transfer of several Spanish-retained German-built tanks to Syria, where they saw service into the 1970s in the Golan and elsewhere. Across Eastern Europe, too, captured German machines were sometimes integrated temporarily into national forces, but the post-war alignment with Soviet equipment and doctrine, favoring the T-34 and later domestic Soviet pattern designs, meant that former German tanks generally had brief second careers. Maintenance realities help explain why the post-war reuse of German armor was limited. Spare parts production for complex components like final drives required industrial capacity and technical documentation many states did not have. The Allied tests had shown that while a Panther's gun and sight were formidable, keeping the vehicle mobile in sustained operations required skilled workshops, long supply chains, and replacement parts that were increasingly scarce in the late 1940s. Consequently, many nations preferred to build new fleets around simpler, more supportable platforms, or to standardize on Allied-supplied equipment under new security arrangements. Over the course of the 1950s, then, most German designs faded from frontline inventories. Meanwhile, the Allies preserved a curated sample of tanks for study, public display, and deterrence. Aberdeen Proving Ground retains several notable examples: Panthers, Tiger I and II turrets, and captured tank destroyers, which underwent live fire testing and mechanical disassembly. These tests generated official reports and film footage that informed both Allied training and post-war armored design. The British collections at Bovington evolved into one of the world's foremost tank museums, preserving unique examples and enabling a public memory of the machines. In France, Saumur's Musée des Blindés amassed pieces reflecting both occupation-era captures and later acquisitions. In the Soviet sphere, Kubinka assembled its own trophy collection, and the museum there preserved rare Tiger and Panther examples, sometimes cannibalized for parts, but also showcased as trophies of victory. Stories of secret stockpiles, bunkers filled with operational Panthers waiting to be unleashed, have a certain appeal, but documentary records and on-site inventories tell a different story. Archival catalogs and transport manifests of the late 1940s document the movement of tanks to scrapyards and steelworks, and Allied Control Council directives mandated demilitarization. While a handful of vehicles certainly escaped immediate scrapping, either because they were set aside for technical study or because they had been spirited away into private hands or foreign arsenals, systematic conservation of large hidden fleets is not supported by the balance of evidence. Where claims of secret caches persist, the more mundane explanations, incomplete records, the survival of a few museum-quality pieces, or the transfer of some vehicles to client states usually account for what people later imagine as hoarded stockpiles. The material afterlife of these vehicles was often unromantic. Steel recovered from armor fed reconstruction projects in a Europe desperate to repair roads, bridges, and factories. Tanks used for riverbank protection or pit fill became part of local infrastructure. On the ground, the hulks that once represented mobile power were simply heavy lumps of steel performing a civil engineering function. Target practice left smoking scars on turrets and sliced plates where ranges tested calibers and firing solutions. Where tanks were preserved, it was usually because of a deliberate decision to keep a representative sample for technical study, propaganda purposes, or public education, and even then, conservators sometimes had to cannibalize parts from one vehicle to keep another in displayable condition. The legacy of this process is twofold. Technically, the Allies and post-war designers absorbed lessons. The value of optical quality and ballistic performance, yes, but also the imperative of mechanical reliability, logistical simplicity, and maintainability. Concepts like sloped armor and the prioritization of crew sighting systems influenced future designs, while the chronic fragility of some late-war German drivetrains reinforced a pendulum swing back toward ruggedness in many post-war armored programs. Culturally, the selective preservation of tanks in museums such as Bovington, Saumur, and Kubinka fixed particular images of the conflict in public memory. The Panther's silhouette, the heavy mass of the Tiger, the compactness of the Stug, all became touchstones in the visual language of World War II. A few concrete case studies illustrate the range of outcomes. Aberdeen's tests on Panthers, Tiger I and II, and Jag Panthers documented excellent ballistics and sights, but recorded repeated failures in final drives and transmissions under extended trials. Hillersleben and Senelager, where British REME teams worked, were hubs for mechanical evaluation and for stripping useful components. The Ruhr plants, Bochum and Essen in particular, processed countless hulks, turning armored plates back into raw steel. The Enns River project and several quarry fill operations show how tanks ended up in civil engineering roles. France's 503rd Combat Tank Regiment's brief experience with Panthers highlights the difficulties of maintaining complex foreign materiel under limited supply conditions. Czechoslovakia's post-war industrial activity demonstrates how German designs and industrial residue were converted into new production lines and export opportunities like the G-13. Spain's retention of Panzer IVs and the later transfer of several of those vehicles to Syria exemplify the international afterlives some tanks enjoyed, sometimes decades beyond 1945. By the 1950s and 1960s, the great majority of German wartime armor had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some hulks remained in the landscape for a while, visible reminders in rural and urban settings. Others were fully recycled or flattened on ranges. The small fraction that survives today is disproportionately visible because museums and restorers have kept them in good condition. That visibility fuels myths, but the archival traces, transport lists, corporate records from steel plants, and official Allied reports create a coherent counter-narrative. Most tanks were destroyed or recycled. A notable number were studied and briefly used abroad. A minority became institutional exhibits. So, returning to the question, what happened to the German tanks that didn't vanish after the war? They followed one of four main paths. Many were systematically demilitarized and broken down for scrap, feeding reconstruction and industry. A significant number were set aside for testing and technical study by US, British, and Soviet teams. Aberdeen, Loworth, Grafenwöhr, and Kubinka among the key sites, where their optics and guns were admired and their driveline weaknesses catalogued. Another portion was redistributed or repurposed, incorporated into foreign armies, used for engineering tasks like riverbank stabilization or quarry fill, or sold and transferred between countries, France, Czechoslovakia, Spain, and Syria being notable examples. Finally, a small but important fraction was preserved in museums and collections. Bovington, Saumur, and Kubinka remain places where these machines are remembered and examined. Taken together, these outcomes mean that while an impression of disappearance persists, the real story is practical and well documented. Most were destroyed or recycled. Some were studied. Fewer were reused in foreign service, and a handful survive as curated artifacts. If you want to follow this trail further, look into Aberdeen's post-war technical reports, the REME archives from Hillersleben, and the catalogues of Kubinka and Bovington. Those sources contain the granular records that back up the summary we've traced here. For more on the maritime side of post-war materiel, what happened to German U-boats, check the linked video next. And if you found this exploration useful, subscribe for more deep dives into the material legacies of war and the surprising, often practical afterlives of the tools of conflict.